welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
Today, we're really getting into it, tackling that huge question. Does God exist?
It's definitely a big one.
Yeah, and we're not here for, speculation or just faith.
Yeah.
We want to dig into the evidence, the actual arguments for and against,
Yeah.
all based on that really comprehensive documentation you shared.
Exactly. The goal is to look at the empirical stuff, the logic, the philosophy laid out there. No wild guesses.
Right. So first things first, we need to be clear on what we mean by God for this discussion, right? Based on the source material.
Absolutely. So for this deep dive, we're working with the definition provided. A being that's omnipotent, all-powerful, omniscient, knows everything.
Okay.
Omnibenevolent, perfectly good. Transcendent, meaning beyond the physical universe.
Yeah.
And the origin of everything.
Got it. Creator.
And yeah, this lines up mostly with monotheistic views, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, but we'll note connections to other ideas like deism or pantheism if they come up in the arguments.
Okay, definition locked. So how are we going to structure this? It's a massive topic.
Well, the plan is, first, look hard at the arguments for God's existence. Then we'll explore relevant scientific perspectives. After that, historical and cultural evidence.
Makes sense.
And importantly, we also need to tackle the main counter-arguments, the reasons people argue against God's existence. Finally, we'll try to pull it all together, synthesize what the sources suggest.
Sounds like a solid roadmap. All right, let's jump in. Arguments for God. Where do we start?
A really foundational one is the cosmological argument.
Okay.
The basic idea is, look, everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore,
the universe must have a cause.
precisely. And to avoid this problem of an infinite regress, like what caused the cause and what caused that cause, forever this first cause must be, well, uncaused, transcendent, which points towards God.
Okay, that infinite regress thing. It's like turtles all the way down, right? Doesn't really solve anything.
Kind of, yeah. It pushes the explanation back infinitely without ever reaching a starting point.
So how does science fit in here? Does it support the idea that the universe had a beginning?
It does, quite strongly, actually. The Big Bang Theory is the standard model. It suggests the universe exploded into being about 13.8 billion years ago from this incredibly hot, dense state.
And that's not just a guess.
Oh, no. There's solid evidence, like the cosmic microwave background radiation, the CMB. Discovered back in '65, it's basically the leftover heat, the afterglow from that initial explosion.
Right, I've heard of that.
And we see galaxies moving away from us, their light is redshifted. That points to expansion. Run the clock back, and everything converges to a single point, a beginning.
Okay, a beginning. So the argument says the beginning needed a cause. But couldn't things just pop into existence without a cause? Quantum physics does weird stuff, right?
That's a common question. But even in quantum mechanics, things don't happen in a total vacuum. Virtual particles, for instance, emerge within existing quantum fields, governed by physical laws. Those fields and laws themselves need an explanation. The cosmological argument is pushing for the ultimate explanation, beyond the physical system itself.
I see. So even quantum events operate within a framework.
Exactly. Plus, you have the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy, or disorder, always increases overall. If the universe had existed forever, it should have reached maximum entropy, like a heat death, ages ago, but it hasn't, which suggests...
It hasn't been around forever. It must have started...
That's the implication, yes.
Okay, that ties the beginning of the universe pretty tightly to this argument. Let's switch gears slightly. The teleological argument, or argument from design, what's the core idea there?
This one focuses on the incredible order and complexity we see everywhere, in the universe, in life. It argues that this level of intricate structure and apparent purpose seems really unlikely to be just random chance. It suggests an intelligent designer.
Okay, design. And the classic example is the fine-tuning of the universe, isn't it?
Absolutely. The physical constants of nature seem balanced on a knife edge. Take gravity. If the gravitational constant were just a tiny bit stronger, the universe would collapse back on itself right after the Big Bang.
Wow.
Tiny bit weaker. Stars and galaxies wouldn't have formed at all, no structure.
So it had to be just right.
Exactly. And then there's the cosmological constant that drives a universe's expansion. Its value is fine-tuned to an almost unbelievable precision. We're talking something like 1 part in 10 to the power of 120.
1 in 10 to the 120. That number's just huge, hard to even grasp.
It really is. The odds against that happening by chance are, well, astronomical doesn't even cover it. It's like trying to find one specific marked atom out of all the atoms in the observable universe.
Okay, that's powerful. And this fine-tuning isn't just physics, right? Biology comes into it, too.
Definitely. The argument often points to the complexity of life itself. Think about DNA, the information encoded in it, the machinery needed to read it and build proteins. It's incredibly sophisticated.
Like a complex blueprint and factory combined.
Sort of, yeah. And the probability of all that assembling by chance, even given billions of years, is calculated by some to be vanishingly small. You might have heard the analogy from Fred Hoyle.
The junkyard and the 747.
That's the one. A tornado blowing through a junkyard isn't likely to assemble a jumbo jet. He argued the odds for life arising randomly were similarly minuscule.
Okay. And then there's this idea, the anthropic principle, that the universe seems set up for us.
Yes, it highlights how many conditions seem perfectly suited for human life to exist. Earth's distance from the sun, our magnetic field protecting us, liquid water, it's all within this very narrow Goldilocks zone.
Not too hot, not too cold.
Exactly. Physicist Martin Rees wrote a book, Just Six Numbers, outlining how unlikely it is that these fundamental constants just happen to fall into the life-permitting range by sheer luck.
And in biology, things like the Cambrian explosion are sometimes mentioned, that sudden burst of life.
Right. The rapid diversification of complex animal life during the Cambrian period is seen by some as challenging purely slow, gradual, naturalistic processes. And information theory, applied to DNA, asks where all that functional, specific information came from. It argues information usually points back to an intelligent source.
But of course, the major scientific explanation here is Darwinian evolution through natural selection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that explain complexity without a designer?
That's the key counterpoint, and it's a very powerful explanation for how life diversifies and adapts once it exists. Natural selection works on self-replicating organisms.
But it doesn't explain the origin of that first self-replicating organism.
Exactly. It presupposes life already exists. And while you have ideas like the multiverse, maybe our universe is just one of many, and we just happen to be in the lucky, fine-tuned one that's still highly speculative.
No direct evidence for other universes.
None, currently. And it adds a whole other layer of complexity you need to explain. Where did the multiverse generator come from?
Right. It sort of pushes the question back again. Okay, so we've done cosmology, design. Let's get philosophical with the ontological argument. This one's purely logical, right? Less about observing the world.
That's right. It's purely conceptual, based on the definition of God, most famously from Anselm.
Okay, break it down for us. How does it work?
It starts with the concept of God as the greatest conceivable being. Nothing greater can be imagined.
Okay, the greatest possible thing we can think of.
Then the argument says, well, which is greater? Something that exists only in your mind, or something that exists in your mind and in reality?
Something that exists in reality seems greater, I guess.
Right. So if God, the greatest conceivable being, existed only in the mind, then you could conceive of something even greater, namely that same being existing in reality.
Mm-hmm.
But that contradicts the starting definition. God is supposed to be the greatest conceivable being. So, to avoid the contradiction,
God must exist not just in the mind, but in reality, too.
That's a conclusion, yeah.
Okay, that's definitely a brain twister. But I know there are famous objections. Didn't Kant have a big problem with it?
He did. Kant argued that existence isn't a predicate or a property like being powerful or being good. Saying something exists doesn't add to its list of qualities. It just states that the concept is instantiated in reality.
So you can't just define something into existence by calling existence a perfection.
That's Kant's point.
Yeah.
And there are parodies, like Gaunilo's Perfect Island. You can imagine the most perfect island, but that doesn't mean it actually exists somewhere.
Right. So how do proponents respond?
Modern defenders, like Alvin Plantinga, refine the argument using modal logic dealing with possibility and necessity. They argue the logic only really works for a necessary being, one whose non-existence is impossible. An island isn't necessary, but they argue God, by definition, is. Plantinga's version argues that if it's possible that a maximally great being exists, then it necessarily exists.
Still very abstract. Okay, let's move to something maybe more grounded in experience. The moral argument. How does morality point to God?
This argument suggests that the existence of objective moral values and duties, things that are truly right or wrong, not just opinions, points towards a transcendent source for that morality, a moral lawgiver, God.
So the idea is without God, morality is just subjective, whatever we decide.
That's the first premise. If God doesn't exist, objective moral values don't exist. The second premise is, but objective moral values do exist. Most people feel deep down that some things, like, say, torturing babies for fun, isn't just distasteful, it's objectively wrong.
Yeah, that seems intuitively true for most people.
So if objective morals exist, the argument concludes they need a foundation, and that foundation is proposed to be God's nature or commands.
What's the evidence that morality isn't just relative, though, that it has this subjective quality?
Well, look across cultures and history. You see broad agreement on core moral principles, prohibitions against murder, theft, valuing fairness, compassion. It suggests something deeper than just cultural convention. Also, our sense of obligation, that feeling we ought to act morally, even when it costs us something. It's hard to explain purely through evolution, which you might think would favor pure self-interest.
Right. Why feel guilty if it helps you survive?
Exactly. And the idea of moral progress, that we can say slavery was wrong and abolishing it was right, seems to imply there's an objective standard we're moving towards or measuring against.
Interesting. Any scientific angles on this?
Some neuroscience research, like Joshua Green's work, suggests we might have innate moral intuitions, sort of hardwired responses. And game theory shows that cooperation and altruism can actually be stable strategies, challenging purely selfish models. It hints at a basis for morality beyond simple calculation.
But what about the Euthyphro dilemma? That's a classic objection, isn't it?
It is. Plato posed it. Is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's already good?
If it's good just because he commands it, morality seems arbitrary. He could command cruelty and it would become good.
Right.
But if he commands it because it's already good, then goodness seems independent of God, maybe even above him.
A real puzzle. The common theistic response is often to say that it's a false dilemma. God doesn't command things arbitrarily, nor does he follow some external standard. Rather, God's own nature is the standard of goodness. Goodness flows from who he is.
So goodness is grounded in God, not external or arbitrary.
That's the idea. Another challenge is evolutionary ethics trying to explain morality purely as an evolved survival mechanism.
Right. Cooperation helps the group survive.
Yes, but critics argue that only explains why we might feel something is right or wrong, descriptive ethics, not whether it actually is objectively right or wrong, prescriptive ethics. It explains our feelings, maybe, but not objective moral truth itself.
Okay. Lots to think about there. One more argument for God. Religious experience. This feels different, more personal.
Very much so. This argument relies on the testimony of countless individuals across time and cultures who claim to have had direct experiences of the divine.
Like mystical experiences, visions, a profound sense of connection.
Exactly. Feelings of awe, overwhelming love, peace, transcendence, encountering a presence. The argument is, so many people report these things, and there are striking similarities in their descriptions, despite different backgrounds. Maybe the best explanation is that they're actually encountering something real, God.
Where do we see these accounts?
Well, they're central to most religious traditions. Think of Moses and the burning bush, Paul's conversion, experiences described in the Vedas or the Quran. But also in modern times, surveys like that Pew Research one from 2009 show a large percentage of people, even today, report having these kinds of spiritual insights or awakenings.
And you mentioned consistency.
Yes, despite the cultural filters, core themes often recur: the sense of unity, timelessness, ineffability, encountering profound love or reality.
Has science looked into this at all? Seems hard to study.
It is, but there's neuroscience research like Andrew Newberg's work scanning the brains of monks and nuns during meditation or prayer. They found specific patterns of brain activity changing during these experiences.
So something measurable is happening in the brain.
Yes. It doesn't prove the experiences of God. Of course, critics say it just shows brain states. But proponents say it shows these aren't just made up. There's a neurological correlate. Also, psychological studies, like that 2019 one mentioned in your source, link these experiences to positive outcomes, like better mental health.
But the obvious criticism is subjectivity, right? It's all in their head, maybe influenced by what they already believe.
That's the main challenge. How can a personal, subjective experience be evidence for anyone else? Proponents might counter that all experience is subjective, even seeing the color red. We trust our senses generally. Why automatically distrust reports of religious experience? And while culture shapes the interpretation, the cross-cultural similarities might suggest a common underlying reality being experienced.
Okay. A lot of different angles arguing for God. Now let's bring science back into focus more directly. How does it specifically interact with this whole question?
Science offers some really interesting data points. In cosmology, as we touched on, the Big Bang points to a beginning. And it's not just the basic theory. You have things like the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems from the 60s, suggesting under general relativity the universe likely began from a singularity.
A point of infinite density.
Essentially, yeah. And more recently, the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV theorem, from 2003. It's quite powerful mathematically. It basically says any universe that has, on average, been expanding throughout its history cannot be eternal in the past. It must have had a beginning.
So, multiple lines of cosmological evidence pointing towards a start date for the universe.
Seems that way, yes. It strengthens that first premise of the cosmological argument we discussed.
And physics. We talked about fine-tuning.
Yeah.
Any other examples?
Oh, yeah, the fine-tuning examples keep coming. We mentioned gravity and the cosmological constant. But think about the electromagnetic force. If it were slightly different, atoms couldn't hold together stably, no chemistry, no molecules, no life.
Wow.
Or the ratio of the mass of a proton to a neutron. Again, incredibly precise. If it were off by a tiny fraction, stable atomic nuclei couldn't form beyond hydrogen, maybe helium. You wouldn't get the heavier elements needed for planets and life.
It really seems like a conspiracy of constants all working together.
That's how it appears to many observers, yes. It's a documented phenomenon that physics has to grapple with.
Now, biology. You mentioned the origin of life. Abiogenesis is still a big puzzle.
It absolutely is. How do you get from non-living chemicals to the first self-replicating cell? It's a huge jump in complexity. Even the simplest bacteria we know of need hundreds of precisely structured proteins working together, plus the whole system for storing and reading genetic information in DNA or RNA.
And science doesn't have a full step-by-step explanation for that yet.
Not a complete, widely accepted one, no. There are promising ideas about RNA worlds or metabolism-first theories, but bridging that gap is a massive challenge. This is where Michael Behe introduced his idea of irreducible complexity.
Right, the bacterial flagellum example often comes up, the little outboard motor.
Exactly. Behe argues systems like that, with multiple essential parts where removing any one part causes the whole thing to fail, couldn't have evolved gradually through Darwinian steps. Each step wouldn't offer a survival advantage until the whole system was complete.
And that's controversial in biology.
Very controversial. Mainstream biology generally rejects it, proposing pathways for how such systems could evolve, maybe co-opting parts from other systems. But Behe's point highlights just how complex even simple life is, and the challenges naturalism faces in explaining its origin.
Okay. And finally, consciousness, the hard problem.
Yes, David Chalmers' term. The easy problems are things like how the brain processes information, controls behavior, integrates sensory input. Science is making progress there. The hard problem is, why does all that physical processing feel like anything at all from the inside? Why is there subjective experience qualia?
Why does red look red? Why does pain feel painful?
Exactly. Materialist explanations based purely on neurons firing haven't really cracked that nut. There's no clear explanation for how physical stuff gives rise to subjective awareness. Some argue this gap points towards something non-physical about consciousness.
And near-death experiences, NDEs, fit in here.
They're sometimes brought up, yes. Researchers like Pim van Lommel studied patients who reported vivid experiences seeing light, meeting deceased relatives, having out-of-body sensations while clinically dead, sometimes with flat EEG readings, indicating minimal or no brain activity.
Suggesting consciousness might persist even without brain function.
That's the controversial implication some draw. Skeptics offer alternative explanations, maybe residual brain activity, effects of drugs, psychological responses. It's heavily debated, but the reports themselves are intriguing in the context of the mind-body problem.
So science doesn't prove God, but it throws up some data and mysteries that seem to resonate with some of the theistic arguments.
That's a fair way to put it. Science describes the how, but these findings raise why questions that science itself might not be equipped to answer.
Okay, let's shift focus again. History and culture. What evidence comes from looking at human history and societies?
A major piece of historical evidence, particularly within Christianity, is the claim of the resurrection of Jesus. If that actually happened, it's presented as powerful evidence for God's existence and intervention.
Right. So what's the historical case based on? Not just the Bible.
Well, the argument relies on analyzing the New Testament documents as historical sources, alongside other contextual evidence. Key points usually include, first, the empty tomb. It's reported in all four Gospels and seems implicitly referenced in very early Christian creeds, like 1 Corinthians 15, which scholars date extremely early, maybe just a few years after the crucifixion.
Okay, empty tomb. What else?
Second, the post-resurrection appearances. Multiple accounts claim Jesus appeared to various individuals, Mary Magdalene, the disciples, even large groups. Paul mentions over 500 people at once, and crucially to former skeptics.
Like Paul himself.
Exactly. Paul went from being a persecutor of the early Christians to arguably its most influential apostle. What caused such a radical turnaround? He claimed it was encountering the risen Christ. Same with James, Jesus' brother, who apparently didn't believe during Jesus' lifetime, but became a leader in the Jerusalem church afterward.
That transformation is a key point then. The disciples changing from scared and hiding to bold preachers facing death.
Yes, that's often cited as strong circumstantial evidence. What motivated them to endure persecution and martyrdom? The argument is they were convinced they had seen the resurrected Jesus. A lie or a mistake seems unlikely to inspire that level of commitment and sacrifice.
What about explanations like hallucinations? Maybe they were just grieving and saw what they wanted to see.
That's a common counter-explanation. The issues raised against it are that hallucinations are usually private, individual experiences, which isn't easily explain group appearances,
Yeah.
and it doesn't explain the empty tomb. Where'd the body go?
And the idea that it was just a myth that grew over time.
The timeline is the main challenge there. The core beliefs about the death and resurrection appear incredibly early in the sources, within years or a couple of decades of the events themselves. That's generally considered too short a time for a complete myth to develop and take hold, especially when eyewitnesses, friendly and hostile, would still have been around.
Okay, so the resurrection is presented as a specific historical event with lines of evidence. What about broader cultural patterns?
The near universality of religious belief itself is often presented as evidence. Across almost all known human cultures, throughout history, people have believed in and worshipped some form of divine or supernatural reality.
Suggesting it's a natural human inclination.
That's the idea. Look at archaeology sites like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. It's dated to around 9600 BCE, before agriculture, suggesting complex religious or ritual behavior might be incredibly ancient, maybe even foundational to human society.
Wow, that far back.
Yeah. Anthropologists like Mircea Eliade studied world religions and found common themes, universal concepts of the sacred versus the profane. And more recently, the cognitive science of religion, people like Justin Barrett, explore the idea that our minds might be sort of cognitively predisposed to detect agency and purpose, making belief in supernatural agents feel intuitive.
Like our brains are wired for belief in some way.
Potentially, yes. It doesn't prove God exists. Obviously, you could argue it's just an evolutionary quirk. But proponents suggest this widespread natural inclination might be because there is something real it's responding to.
Okay. So we've covered arguments for scientific angles, historical claims. Now, we absolutely have to address the big counter-arguments, the reasons people give for not believing, and the biggest one is probably
the problem of evil. Without a doubt, it's maybe the most significant challenge to belief in an all-powerful, all-good God.
right. How can such a God exist alongside so much suffering and evil in the world? Earthquakes, diseases, war, cruelty.
The argument puts it starkly. If God is omnipotent, he can prevent evil. If he's omniscient, he knows about evil. If he's omnibenevolent, he wants to prevent evil. But evil exists. Therefore, a God with all three attributes seems not to exist.
It's a powerful emotional and logical challenge. How do theists respond? What are the theodicies?
There are several major lines of response. One is the free will defense, often associated with Alvin Plantinga.
Okay.
The core idea is that God valued creating beings capable of genuine love and moral goodness, but genuine love requires free will, the ability to choose. And if you have free will, you necessarily have the ability to choose wrongly, to choose evil.
So the evil we see is the price of free will, which is necessary for a greater good like love.
Largely, yes, particularly for moral evil, the bad things humans do to each other. God allows it because preventing it would mean removing our freedom, making us robots or puppets, incapable of a genuine relationship.
But what about natural evil? Tsunamis, cancer, animal suffering. That doesn't seem directly caused by human choices.
That's where other theodicies often come in. The soul-making theodicy, linked to John Hick, suggests that a world with challenges, difficulties, and even suffering is actually the best kind of environment for developing character. Virtues like courage, compassion, resilience, they often only emerge when we face hardship.
So the world is like a gymnasium for the soul. Suffering helps us grow stronger morally and spiritually.
That's the analogy, yes. It argues God's purpose isn't just to make us comfortable, but to enable our development into virtuous beings. Another response, especially for natural evil, points to the need for consistent natural laws. For the universe to be orderly and predictable, allowing us to act freely and learn, it needs stable laws of physics and biology. But those same laws, operating consistently, will inevitably lead to things like tectonic plates shifting, earthquakes, or cells mutating cancer.
So natural evils are unfortunate byproducts of the regular lawful universe needed for life and free action.
That's one argument. And finally, some appeal to the mystery of evil, acknowledging that our finite human minds might not fully grasp God's ultimate reasons for permitting certain evils. His perspective might be vastly broader than ours.
Okay, so there are responses, though the problem definitely remains a tough one. What's another major counterargument?
The argument from divine hiddenness.
Right. If God exists and wants us to believe in him, why isn't he more obvious? Why all the ambiguity?
Exactly. The argument goes, a perfectly loving God would desire a relationship with everyone. Such a relationship requires belief. Therefore, a loving God would ensure his existence was clear enough that anyone honestly seeking him could find him. But many sincere non-believers exist who say they just don't see enough evidence.
Yet such a God doesn't exist, or he doesn't really desire that relationship in the way we think.
Precisely. The perceived hiddenness is seen as evidence against God's existence, or at least against the traditional concept of a loving, relational God.
How do theists reply to this one? Why might God remain hidden?
Some responses echo the free will defense. If God's existence were overwhelmingly obvious, like the sun in the sky, belief wouldn't be a free choice anymore. It might coerce assent rather than invite faith and trust. Hiddenness preserves our freedom to respond genuinely.
So God wants faith, not forced knowledge.
That's one line of thought. John Hick's idea of epistemic distance is related. He argued God maintains a certain distance to allow us space to grow morally and spiritually through making our own choices in faith, rather than being constantly overwhelmed by divine presence.
So the ambiguity itself serves a purpose.
That's the claim. Others might point back to religious experiences, arguing God does reveal himself, but perhaps more personally and subjectively, rather than through universally compelling public evidence.
But still, the sheer diversity of beliefs and the number of atheists and agnostics seems to suggest God isn't exactly making himself plain to everyone.
It does pose that challenge. Theistic responses might include ideas of progressive revelation through history, or that cultural factors and personal willingness play a role in perceiving the evidence that is available. Maybe non-belief isn't always purely down to lack of evidence, but other factors too.
Okay. And the final big category of counter-arguments revolves around naturalistic explanations, right? Science making God redundant.
Yes. This is the broad idea that science is increasingly providing explanations for things previously attributed to God, making the God hypothesis unnecessary.
The God of the gaps.
Exactly. Evolution explains life's complexity. Neuroscience explains the mind and religious feelings. Cosmology offers models like quantum fluctuations or the multiverse to explain the universe's origin without needing a creator. The argument is that science is progressively closing the gaps where God used to reside.
So eventually, science will explain everything, and there'll be no need for God.
That's the trajectory proponents of this view see. Theistic responses often highlight what they see as the limits of science or naturalism. Science is great at explaining the how, the mechanisms of the natural world. But can it answer the why questions? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the ultimate source of the laws science discovers? What about meaning, purpose, objective morality?
So science and theism might not be mutually exclusive, but could be complementary, explaining different aspects of reality.
That's a common view, that they address different levels of explanation. Evolution might explain biological diversification, but theism might address why there's a universe amenable to life in the first place. Also, critics point out that many of the proposed naturalistic alternatives, especially for the universe's ultimate origin or consciousness, are themselves highly speculative and lack strong empirical evidence.
Like the multiverse, it's an idea, but not something we can currently test or observe.
Right. So the argument becomes whether those speculative scientific ideas are really more plausible or less faith-based than theistic explanations.
Okay. We have covered an incredible amount of ground. Arguments for, scientific data, history, culture, and the major counterarguments. Let's try to synthesize this. Pulling it all together based on the sources, what's the overall picture?
Looking back, the case for God presented in the documentation draws strength from several areas. You have the cosmological and teleological arguments connecting with scientific findings about the universe's beginning and fine-tuning.
The universe seems to have started, and it seems weirdly set up for life.
Right. Then you have the logical arguments, ontological and moral tackling concepts of being and goodness. Plus, the historical case for the resurrection, which is unique and powerful if accepted. And the persistent, widespread phenomenon of religious experience. Proponents see these lines converging into a strong cumulative case.
But then you weigh that against the counterarguments we just discussed.
Exactly. And those challenges are serious. The problem of evil is deeply troubling. Science has provided powerful naturalistic explanations for many things. And the question of why God isn't more obvious, the hiddenness argument, resonates with many.
So, evaluating it all, based on the comprehensive docs, where does the balance seem to fall? Is it proof? No proof. Strong evidence. Weak evidence.
The conclusion drawn from the material seems to be this. Absolute mathematical certainty about God's existence is likely unattainable for metaphysical claims like this. However, the evidence for God is presented as substantial and multifaceted.
Not just one single killer argument, but multiple lines pointing in a similar direction.
Correct. The cosmological and teleological arguments, especially with their scientific links, are often seen as particularly strong. The moral argument and religious experiences add personal and philosophical weight. The resurrection stands as a specific historical claim.
And the counterarguments.
They're acknowledged as significant hurdles, but the sources suggest there are plausible theistic responses to them. While science explains much, it may not explain everything, and some scientific alternatives remain speculative. The problem of evil is profound, but the Odysseys offer potential frameworks for understanding it.
So, not a slam dunk either way. But the documents lean towards the evidence for God being pretty robust, even if not absolute proof.
That seems to be the synthesis presented, yes. It's about weighing the evidence, the arguments, the counter-arguments, and seeing which overall picture seems more coherent and explanatorily powerful.
Well, this has been incredibly thorough, a real deep dive into a massive subject. Thanks for walking us through all of that complexity.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating and fundamental area of inquiry.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on God's existence, we've really journeyed across a huge landscape, from cosmology down to personal experience and morality. Absolute certainty might be elusive, like you said, for these big metaphysical questions. But hopefully, exploring these arguments, grounded in the science, philosophy, and history from your sources, gives you, the listener, a solid framework for thinking about it all.
Right. This isn't the end of the conversation, obviously. Personal interpretation plays a huge role.
Which brings us to the final thought for you listening. Which arguments, for or against, really struck a chord with you? Why do they resonate? And maybe reflect on how the limits of our own human knowledge might influence how we even approach questions this big.
Definitely. And if your curiosity is piqued, absolutely look into the thinkers mentioned in the sources: Aquinas, Craig, Plantinga on one side, maybe Dawkins or other critics on the other, scientists like Martin Rees. There's a wealth of material out there to continue the exploration.